In this video, we'll be looking at population size. Now, the word population refers to the number of organisms existing in a particular area. So we can be using this in terms of ecosystem, or looking at the number of animals or plants in a particular habitat, or we can also be using this term to describe the number of bacteria or microorganisms growing in, let's say, in terms of biotechnology, growing in a bioreactor. So what we're going to look at today is the general population growth curve, and then looking at the different stages of it and the things that would affect a population size. Now, you may remember this particular graph when we were looking at the standard growth curve in the biotechnology chapter 22. Now, actually, it is talking about the same thing. The standard growth curve is the population growth curve. So here we'll look at the three stages again. So the first phase here is called the slow growth region. Then here we've got the second stage, rapid growth, obviously because the number of organisms is increasing exponentially. Then we've got the third stage, the stable state, which is referring to the number of organisms sort of fluctuating, but mostly at the same sort of range. Now, if we're looking at this curve in terms of bacteria, then obviously if it's a batch culture, then the number of organisms would eventually decrease, which is what we call the death phase. But if we're looking at this in terms of general ecosystem, most of the time the organisms will mainly stay at the stable state at the end of that. Now, keeping in mind, actually, same as before, whenever we're looking at the population growth curve or standard growth curve, we're always comparing the birth rate and the death rate. So for the very beginning, the organisms are still getting used to the environment. So we say the birth rate is just slightly above the death rate. So therefore, the graph is going slowly upwards. And then later on, they are more used to the environment now. So the birth rate is much higher than the death rate, therefore the rapid growth. Then ultimately, the birth rate and the death rate, it's pretty much the same, and it fluctuates at the stable state. And the reason why we say that death rate is becoming slightly higher, almost to the same point of birth rate, is because of limiting factors. Now, as you would remember, limiting factors are basically environmental impacts on a particular situation which stops it from growing any further. And in this case, we can have two types of limiting factors, biotic and abiotic. Abiotic are non-living factors, so really very much about the environmental inorganic factors. Biotic factors refer to things that are living. In terms of biotic factors, there are usually three of them. So predation, competition, and diseases. We'll actually look into a little bit more detail on in terms of the predation bit and the competition bit in the next two videos. So diseases is referring to microorganisms or pathogens that would impact the health of the organisms, and therefore obviously decreasing its population size. So these are the biotic factors. Abiotic factors will be things like humidity, water and oxygen levels, light intensity, the pH, and the temperature. So these are all non-living factors that would affect the number of organisms within a population. Keeping in mind that these are things that would affect how their body works or how well they are adapted to the environment, and that is how they would affect it. So we sometimes say that the organisms or the population is at its carrying capacity. Carrying capacity refers to the maximum population size that an environment can support. So it is referring to looking at in that particular habitat or that particular environment in terms of biotic and abiotic factors. If that is as much as many individuals of a species can survive at that state, then that's it. That's what we call the carrying capacity. So that's referring to the average level within this fluctuation here. Now, sometimes there are other factors that would affect a population size, and these are the mainly two ones, the migration and density independent factors. Migration is referring to the movement of a whole species or organisms going from one place to the other. And there can be mainly two types, immigration and emigration. So immigration is about coming into a particular habitat. So like we talk about immigrants, will be the people coming from other countries into your own country. So immigration means organisms moving into a new habitat. Emigration means organisms moving out of a place. So when we say when the season changes and there are birds that would fly from one habitat to the next, so we say that they are emigrating from their original habitat and then immigrating into the next one. So that is migration. So previously we mentioned how population sizes can be affected by these different limiting factors. So let's think about competition, for example. If within your species, within your population, there's a lot of you, then there will be more competition among you. So that's kind of dependent on the size of your population. So that is what we call a density dependent factor. However, in the case of density-independent factors, these are factors that will change the population size regardless of the size of it. So these are things like natural disasters, things like earthquakes, storms, tsunamis, fires, etc. These are things that it doesn't matter how many individuals you have in that population, it's going to have an impact on it whatsoever. So a quick summary, here we've got a population growth curve. You can see we've got the slow growth in the beginning, rapid growth, and then stable state by comparing the birth rate and the death rate at each of these stages. And we say at the stable state, the population is at its carrying capacity, which is its maximum population size that the environment can support at that time. And the reason why the population size would stop at that point is because the limiting factors, which can largely be split into biotic and abiotic factors. Some of the things would be things like migration and density-independent factors that would affect the size of your population regardless of the initial size.